Good. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. My name is Noah Davis. I'm a consultant at Montana State University Red Bluff Research Branch. And today we're going to be talking about rotational grazing and electric fencing. And what it's going to look like is we're going to talk about basic grazing management principles, and we're going to get a 30,000-foot view of what exactly is happening when we're grazing and how our management influences that. And then we're going to go into the specifics of rotational grazing and grazing using electric fences. Sound good? Okay. A little bit of background on myself. I started using electric fence grazing 9 years ago. I was responsible for a group of 20 steers. Since then, I've moved into the role I'm in now. I'm currently a master's student at Montana State University, getting a degree in animal and range science. I do a lot of work with grazing behavior, looking at GPS collars on cows. That gets close to, but not quite cow psychology. There's a lot of cow psychology that goes into why cows do what they do. But maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And so I've had experience with grazing management on really small scales and really decently large scales, not the biggest scales, but so I've seen a little bit, and we're going to talk about my experiences and what I've learned so far today. This is all a work in progress. If you asked me to do this talk in 5 years, I'm sure a lot of what I would say would be different, but that's all part of it. Okay, so there are 4 main principles or pillars of range management, of grazing management. And these are the foundational things that underlie all decisions you make and that are the primary drivers of what happens as a result of your management. First one is stocking rate. And we're going to go through all of these in detail a little more in the presentation, but this is by far the most important grazing management decision you make. Season of use is also very important. Kind of animal, we'll talk more about what that means, and livestock distribution on the landscape. All of these interact with one another and in a pretty complex way. It's been said that grazing management is more complex than rocket science, and in a way that's true. Most all natural sciences are, just because there's not hard and fast rules. Everything is soft and changes, and it's almost inarticulate. Okay, so stocking rate, like I said, the most important grazing management decision you make. This has a greater impact than season of use. So if you're grazing in the growing season, dormant season in May or September or whatever, stocking rate is by far more important than that. And it is by far more important than any grazing system you use. That includes whether or not you're grazing under electric fence or you're not, or whatever you're doing. If you don't have the stocking rate right, everything else is not going to work how you want it to or how it should. Okay, so how you set your stocking rate is determined by your management goals. What are you managing a piece of landscape for, and why are you grazing there? Is your goal to maximize profit? That is a goal of many livestock producers. It is their business, it's their livelihood, and so they want to maximize the amount of product they're making for the most amount of money they can in a sustainable way, of course, because if that's not sustainable, their business isn't going to be sustained. Are you looking to maximize animal performance? That is also a goal of many livestock producers, but a little bit different perspective on it. Maybe rather than maximizing total profit, you're producing individual animals. Your stocking rate might be a little bit different. Range health. This is a lot of conservation organizations and different entities. Livestock they use them, but they're more as a tool to achieve range health. Or wildlife habitat modification. Livestock are a tool just like anything else. And you can do a whole lot to manipulate habitat. And the stocking rate that you set determines everything else. Like I said, it's the most important factor. It determines your livestock performance, how well your cows are doing, how well they breed up, what your weaning weight on your calves are. All of this is directly and quite strongly influenced from your stocking rate. Vegetation, this makes sense. If your stocking rate's really heavy, vegetation is not going to be doing too well. Your stocking rate's really light. You have the potential to improve your range condition, like I said, wildlife habitat and economic return. We touched on that up here as well. There's general guidelines, but like I said, it really is an art and you need experience to do it really well. Okay, go over some terms because there are a lot of terms and they're not always very well defined. Stocking rate. This is the number of animals on a given amount of land over a given period of time. That's a whole lot of words, but basically think about it as the amount of forage you are removing over a unit of land, okay? Typically expressed in two of the most common ways as AUMs per acre or acres per AUM, and we're going to talk about what AUMs are. That's the animal unit month, which is just a measure of feed, a quantity of feed. Now, stocking density, similar concept, but different. This is animal concentration or the number of animals on a unit of land. So this removes the time aspect from your stocking rate, or if you're looking at it a different way, stocking density plus time equals your stocking rate. Typically expressed in number of animal units per acre, you can think about how many cows per acre are you running at a given time? Is this 100 cows on 20 acres, or is it 300 cows on 2 acres? Very different stocking density, but based on the amount of time that you're on that particular piece of ground, the stocking rate may be the same. Since we're talking about electric fencing and intensive grazing, this is also very often expressed as pounds per acre. That is pounds per animal per acre. 50,000 pounds an acre, 100, 200, 300, even 1 million pounds an acre, some people have done in the past. And this is related to animal impact on the landscape. Now, animal unit concept. This is a broad concept used in rangeland management, especially by the government agencies. One animal unit is basically a mature cow with a calf that is up to 3 months of age. And she consumes the equivalent of about 26 pounds of forage per day. So again, this is, we talk about density, how many animal units per acre. We add time to that, that becomes our animal unit month. So this is the amount of forage I was talking about. The unfortunate thing is, even though this is a really nice concept, there is broad disagreement about what these things mean. So just for an example, NRC, that's a scientific publication, they define one animal unit month as 660 pounds of forage. NRCS, they say it's 910 pounds of feed. Obviously, if you're doing the same calculations, but your definition is different, you're going to come up with wildly different answers to the question of how many cows should I be running or can I be running. Lastly, animal unit equivalent. This is basically a abstraction of our animal unit concept so that we can compare the relative intake of different species. So now we can compare elk and cows and sheep and cows, or anything that is an herbivore or consumes forage. Nice concept. It makes things really clean and you can talk across disciplines and within disciplines. It's easy to apply to large groups. You'd say quite often you look at the capacity of a pasture based on the number of AUMs that you can take from it. Often used by the agencies. And the idea is to, based on the size, class, age, and number of animals you have, is to use the animal unit equivalent adjustment. However, there are a handful of disadvantages with this system. This assumes that all cows are 1,000 pounds. That is true for very, very few operations. Most places are anywhere from 12 to 1,400. I weighed cows this morning. I've got some cows that are 1,800 pounds and others that are 1,100 pounds. Average weight's about 1,350 at Red Bluff. And so if I'm assuming all of my cows are one animal unit, I'm going to be off by quite a bit. The base concept doesn't adjust for calf age or forage intake based on forage quality, supplementation, or anything else that's going to affect how much the cow is consuming. You can adjust that with your animal unit equivalency, but that's not always done. In fact, that's almost never done. And okay, intake due to season, that's due to forage quality. When the grass is green, cows are going to be more. Yeah, Linda, do you have a question?
What is the E on the animal unit?
Animal unit equivalency.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Basically, it just oversimplifies things. It's nice to use, but it is very basic. I really don't use it in my management, but you'll see it everywhere. You can work around these issues by using animal unit equivalency. But like I said, it isn't used very often. If you guys have any questions, I think our group is small enough that feel free just to raise your hand and ask her. If I don't see you, just shout it out. So any questions so far? Okay, we're getting through this, then we'll get into the meat of it. When we are determining what our stocking rate should be, we think about this, that we have a supply and we have a demand and they have to equal each other. If they don't equal each other, we're either going to be overstocked or understocked. If we're overstocked, we're going to hurt the range, going to hurt our animals' performance for economic return in the long term. If we're understocked, we're going to be missing out on those opportunities. Sometimes you can be strategically understocked, but if that is not your goal, then what are you doing it for? Demand for determining our stocking rate. This is the number of head that we are running in a group or on the ranch or whatever management unit we're talking about. Their daily intake. Generally, we think about this in pounds per day. If it is a 10-month-old heifer, she's going to be eating a whole lot less than a mature cow that is lactating and raising a calf. And then we look at the number of days in our grazing unit that we're looking at and multiply that all together. That determines the pounds of feed that we have in demand. Now our supply, this is our pasture. How big is our pasture acreage? What is the productivity of the pasture? Is it 800 pounds an acre or 1,600 pounds an acre? And then utilization factor. This is the most important part of the equation that we set, because this determines how much of this acreage and forage production that we're going to take. It is quite often said the rule of thumb is 50% use. In my opinion, that's pretty high for most of the rangeland around here. I think it should be a little bit lower than that in a lot of cases. But if this is too high, then even if we have everything else right, we're going to be overgrazing. The other thing that goes into the utilization factor is livestock distribution. Our cows don't graze pastures evenly, so there's going to be a lot of the pasture that is unused in a lot of cases. And until we can improve that, we have to live with it, because if we don't factor that in right here, we're going to be overgrazing a lot of our pasture. Okay, there's a lot on this slide. Basically, grazing impacts vegetation. We all know that, but it's always good to revisit. You've heard this said before, if you prune the shoots of a plant, you're going to prune the roots. With our prairie grasses, there is at least as much root biomass underground as there is above ground. Quite often it's actually more than that. And when a plant is grazed, or really any disturbance, it translocates nutrients and carbohydrates from the roots to regrow leaf tissue. Because for the plant, it needs mineral and water uptake from the roots, but it really needs its leaves because those are the solar panels it uses. And so it needs both. And so it tries to balance things out when it gets grazed. Okay, but if any of you have ever sat in a pasture and watched cattle graze, they don't walk through a pasture and graze every single plant to the same exact height evenly. They're incredibly selective, and they're actually pretty intelligent creatures, even if sometimes they're not. And they will graze certain plants to certain heights. They'll graze certain parts of plants, and this all changes throughout the year based on their dietary preference and needs. When one plant is grazed next to one that is not grazed, the plant that is not grazed has the competitive advantage because it does not, it still has all of its solar panels going on. It still has all of its roots under the ground. And so now this one can keep growing. This other plant that did get grazed, that one is going to be set at a disadvantage. It has to regrow. Meanwhile, this one is getting bigger. Maybe it's producing seed, maybe it has rhizomes and it's producing sucker plants. This can lead to a change in forage composition over time, degrading the range condition. Maybe if weeds are introduced, they will increase in size and number. And it can reduce forage production. Here's a picture of a ranch I worked on in Geyser. These two spots, they're pastures that border each other. The difference you see is strictly due to the stocking rate. Picture on the left, heavily grazed every spring, 630 pounds of forage per acre. Picture on the right, this thing is almost entirely ungrazed. 3,600 pounds of standing crop of forage per acre and many years of dead that are standing as well. It's hard to tell on the screen, but the species composition is different. You see it's a little bit more gray and a little bit more yellow. That's curly cut gumweed and French sagewort. Over here, almost entirely crested wheatgrass. Cows graze down the crested wheatgrass here because that's the only thing they have. And the forbs increase in size and number. Not the crested wheatgrass is the best thing, but it's a whole lot better than just having a pasture of French sage and curly cut gumweed. Okay, next, grazing distribution. This is our second pillar. Poor distribution, like I said, in adjusting our utilization factor when we're determining our stocking rate, that is the greatest limiting factor. If we didn't have to adjust for poor distribution in our pastures, we could be stocked. Most ranches that have in the West have problems with distribution. And if they didn't have to adjust for that, they could run a lot more animals sustainably. And this is the result of a handful of things. Among them are slope. All livestock try to avoid slope if they can, to a point, right? There are some that will use slopes to a point. Sheep like a lot more steep slopes than cows do. Some wildlife species really like slope. Anyway, for most of our livestock species we're using, if it's too much slope, they're not going to use it. Distance from water, if it's too far, and that is often there's interaction between slope and distance from water, they're not going to go use part of the pasture. And then variation in plant communities, this goes down to our livestock being very selective animals. They're going to go to the spots with the best feed and the most amount of it, and they're going to avoid the areas that don't. Here is a map of the pasture at Red Bluff. If you're familiar with Red Bluff, here is the cemetery. Here's the old headquarters and the stone barn. This is a 1,500 acre pasture. And these are, it's a heat map of distribution based on GPS collars on the cows in the winter. And you can see where the cows like to hang out. Down here in the bottom, and then up here, there's a big grassy draw. And they are not using a majority of that pasture. If I were to stock this pasture at the level of the entire thing, then we'd have problems. We'd be overgrazing the bottoms, and the preferred areas, which we see occasionally. Now, third pillar, season of use. For grazing to be sustainable in the long term, our plants have to be able to recover from grazing. This recovery happens during the growing season. That is the combination of time based on the climate where temperature is adequate for growing and there is moisture in the soil. So whenever we're getting precip. For most of the West, it's 45 to 120 days. Here, Southwest Montana, we're limited by temperature for a while. And then after sometime in June, we get pretty limited by moisture. So we're on the lower end of this. We get into 120 days as you go further east in the Dakotas where they have longer, warmer growing season and growing season precip. Different plants have different abilities to recover from grazing, and we need to factor that into when we're thinking about season of use. Most of our perennial native bunch grasses are able, they have less of an ability to recover from grazing than say a lot of the introduced species, such as crusted wheatgrass, smooth brome. They are a lot more resilient. And so we need to be just conscientious of that. We also need to remind ourselves there's a difference between rest and recovery. I can rest a pasture from November through April, and that's really not going to do you too much good because we're not in this growing season. So this pasture, the plants in that pasture are not going to be able to recover. I like the term recovery just to remind myself of that. Okay, our fourth pillar, kind of herbivore that we are using. What does this mean? It is important for us when we are considering grazing management to select an herbivore that fits our forage resources and our management objective. So this not only includes species, so whether they're sheep or cows or goats or alpacas or whatever, but also the class. So is it a weaned calf or lamb? Is it a yearling? Or is it a mature cow or ewe? And production stage. So that means say it's a cow, is she dry or is she lactating? Is it early gestation or late gestation? Because that influences how this animal is going to behave in a grazing environment. If you get the herbivore right, then it makes the other three pillars we talked about a whole lot easier because she's going to work with you. If you don't get it right, or if you have a less than ideal herbivore, it's going to cause problems. So a couple examples. If you are doing targeted grazing and you want to target leafy spurge, I would not recommend cows with calves. You're gonna have a lot of problems there. Think about yearling ewes. Okay, you don't have to worry about lambs and their sheep. They are able to consume leafy spurge without problem. Or if, think about that picture of crested wheatgrass, 3,600 pounds an acre. Most cows are going to avoid that because it is rank, it's really low quality, it's coarse, it's not very palatable, but you can use it if you manage your animals properly. And I would submit the best animal to use that is a dry cow during the dormant season because she's a bulk roughage consumer, meaning she's designed to eat large amounts of low quality feed, and she's not lactating. Her nutrient requirements are at the lowest at that time. And it's going to work out a whole lot better than if you're using, say, sheep, for example. Okay, so now moving on to rotational grazing. Why do we want to rotationally graze? There are so many specialized grazing systems. If we start at the very bottom, we talk about continuous grazing, where animals are out in the same pasture 12 months out of the year. Or here in the north, it's mostly restricted to season-long grazing. So the entire growing or grazing season effectively. And why would we not just do that? So we have to ask ourselves that question. The goal of any grazing system is going to be to change the pattern of plant defoliation. When we break it down, That's really all we're trying to do. If we're doing a rest rotation system where we don't graze an entire pasture for a year, we are ensuring that all the plants in that pasture are not going to be grazed during the growing season that we're resting it for that time. If we are doing some sort of high intensity grazing rotation, we are ensuring that all the plants in that rotation are grazed, usually quite heavily, but for a very short period of time, and then they have time to recover. Okay, yeah, this is in time, in space, and intensity. In time, like I said, is this plant going to be grazed twice in the same growing season, or is it just going to be once, or is it going to be once every 2 years, twice every 3 years? What's that pattern going to be? In space, I talked about plant being grazed severely and the plant next to it not being grazed at all. There are certain grazing systems where you manage the animals and they graze everything uniformly. And then in intensity, similar, you can graze everything quite severely, you can graze everything moderately. The important thing is you need to change the pattern of plant foliation if you're going to be using a grazing system that works, but it has to be when it matters to the plants. And again, this goes back to whether plants have just rest during the dormant season or whether they have recovery that is actually going to matter to them. Because if you implement a grazing system and you go to all the work to do it, put in the labor, the time, the materials, but it doesn't actually change anything for what the plants are experiencing that matters to them, then it might just have been extra labor and cost. So we have our 4 pillars. Grazing systems are directed at altering season of use. They have implications for the other 3, but primarily they're going to alter season of use. Grazing distribution, if you are moving animals from one pasture or paddock, that is of course going to influence where they're grazing. They can't be grazing somewhere that you don't have them. It also influences localized use, which we can think of as effective stocking rates. So like we're talking about grazing distribution. If your animals are not using one area, even though your pasture stocking rate may be one number, the effective stocking rate in that area is quite low. Or if they are congregating in an area, the effective stocking rate there is quite high. But with the grazing system, you can change the localized use based on the grazing distribution. Now, we all think about grazing systems as being extremely important, and those are the things that we want to go to change first. If we encounter any problems in our management, we have anything we want to change with the 4 pillars we were talking about. I would submit to you, though, that if you are thinking about putting in some sort of grazing system or ramping up the intensity of the grazing management you're doing to address problems with distribution, first consider alternatives. Because like I said, if it doesn't work out, it might just be a lot of time and labor. And there might be a cheaper, potentially better way. Okay, salt mineral replacement. Most people provide their livestock with salt and mineral. This is an attractant to them. If you want to bring them to an area of the pasture they are not using, place salt and mineral in that area. Very simple. Just make sure your livestock know where it's at, and that will be a minor draw. Really simple fix, but everyone's already using it anyway, and so this is something you can use. Supplement use. Not everyone supplements, but there are a lot of times that supplementation will be justified, might not be justified for everyone. However, it's primarily a nutritional, addresses nutritional issues with the forage, but it can be used also as a distribution changer. I use it all the time. I supplement my cows in the wintertime, and I'm very strategic with where I feed them the supplement so that I can improve distribution throughout the pasture, and it works incredibly well. When animals consume supplement in an area, it, again, like I said, psychology of the cows, it builds a positive associative effect with that area. And so even once they've consumed the supplement, they will return to that area for days and even weeks after they've finished eating the supplement, because they, in their mind, they think this is a good spot because I have gotten good feed from there. Water development. So if you're going to build fences and put in a grazing system, or like I said, improve the grazing system you're on, you're going to have to build more water tanks. You're going to have to develop more springs. But if you are doing this primarily because you have poor distribution, potentially you can try just building your water tanks, developing your water sources first. And that may really help with your distribution problem, especially if you have your water sources in water gaps, or you have a valve that can bypass the tank, so your livestock are forced to use one tank or another. Change season of use. And I'll talk about this for the next one too. Season of use and herbivore. We just talked about the different species and classes of animal. They all use the landscape quite differently. And season, time of the year, when it's really hot in the summertime, animals are not going to want to climb. If they are raising a calf or a lamb, they're going to be tied to that baby, and they're not going to be able to range as far as they would otherwise. And so in general, dormant season use, when it's the fall or the winter, your animals are going to use the pasture a whole lot better. So you might consider changing when you're using a pasture, or changing the animal you're using. Might not work. Everyone, red block has cows and sheep. I can be pretty flexible with what grazes where. Not everyone has that luxury, but if you have cows, you probably also have heifers. That's a different class of animal. They use pastures generally better, and you can do a lot of supplementation with them. Sometimes for the little weak calves they have. And so if you get creative, you can be pretty flexible with what you're doing. Now, I would submit to you that there are times when advanced grazing systems are not needed, when basic, bare bones, simple management is all that is needed. Like I said, stocking rate is the most important factor of our grazing management. If your stocking rate is anything more than what is considered moderate for the range that you're on, for the plants that are there, it is going to have implications and screw things up for the rest of your grazing management. So if your stocking rate's moderate, that's good. If your rangeland is already healthy and you don't need to improve it, or you don't want to improve it, then you might not need a more advanced grazing system than what you currently have in place. And if your livestock distribution is acceptable, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, but if you are happy enough with how your animals use the pasture, or if you're able to use those tools I was just talking about on the previous slide, and you can get distribution that works for you, then you might not need to ramp up management of your livestock. Good grazing management doesn't have to be complicated. And I just want to emphasize that, because in my mind, and I think a lot of our minds, we want to be doing things. We want to be out managing our livestock and really doing a good job. But to be doing a good job, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be doing more. We just have to be doing what we're doing well and thoughtfully. So what does rotational grazing actually do for us? And when I say rotational grazing in this, I really mean any kind of grazing system or method of grazing that ramps up the intensity, frequency of movement, decreases pasture or paddock size. I've got a slide here. It really is the spectrum of things. So when I say rotational grazing, I mean that in the broadest sense possible. As we increase intensity of our rotations or implement a rotational grazing system to begin with, this gives us much finer control over the four pillars of rangeland and grazing management. We can control the stocking rate in each of our paddocks or each of our pastures. We might have different goals for different vegetation types or different pastures or different range conditions. We can say, I'm going to graze this one a little bit harder. I'm going to graze this one a little bit lighter. Whereas if we just have one large area that is difficult for us to control livestock on, you have the one stocking rate, and wherever their livestock go, the effective stocking rate is quite variable. Season of use. So with a shorter duration, even if you're cutting it down from 4 months in a pasture to 2 months in a pasture, or 1 month in a pasture, you have a whole lot more control when the livestock are there and when they're not there to alter season of use, which affects forage quality that your livestock are consuming, affects distribution, and affects plant recovery. Many of the rotational or advanced grazing systems emphasize a period for vegetation recovery, and that is what most of them were formed from. Most of these rotational advanced grazing systems got their start in the old days of open range, tragedy of the commons, and oh no, we've done bad things to the rangeland. What do we do to make it better? We need to allow a period of recovery for vegetation, and everything has since developed from there. Furthermore, if we have different paddocks in our grazing system, we don't have to use the same animals. Like I said, we can change the class or the species of livestock we're using in each one based on whatever works best with our goals. And we have a more even distribution based solely on the fact that our animals are going to be in the area that they're confined in. Rather than having access to the whole area, they're going to be here for this period of time and here for the next period of time. And if you're using electric fence, you can literally sculpt the landscape, which is pretty exciting. The other thing is that you have a more efficient use of the landscape, meaning there is less forage that is wasted due to trampling, due to soiling from manure and urine. And so if we think about our utilization factor that we use when we're calculating our stocking rate, that includes an amount of wastage due to trampling and laying down and soiling. But as we increase the intensity of our grazing management, there less and less of that feed is wasted and the animals are consuming more. So even if our stocking rate, what the plant experiences is the same, our animals are consuming more of that forage. And so it's a more efficient system. Does that make sense? And then because our management units are much smaller, we can tailor whatever we're doing to each of those units by doing all of these things. Okay, here is our scale of intensity of grazing management. On the left side, this is very extensive grazing management. This is continuous or season-long grazing. Doesn't require a whole lot of inputs per se in terms of infrastructure or labor. And as you go down the scale, these aren't necessarily in perfect order, but generally this is kind of how it would go. And there are many more grazing systems on this. This is just the basic ones that we generally all think of. You go from one pasture, your animals are in, to several rest and deferred rotation systems. Again, those can really mean anything. To intensive grazing management, where you are moving animals every week, or for the most intense grazing management, moving them every day, and some people multiple times per day. These last two categories are what I refer to as management intensive grazing. I'll talk about this in a minute, but that's just the term I use. There's a whole lot of terms. Okay, my recommendation would be to use a mix of grazing systems. Subscribing to a single grazing system is fine, but I think you should tailor your management to your different management units. If that's existing pastures or pastures that will be developed. They're probably gonna have different goals and different needs. And so I would recommend that you look at the grazing systems, look at what they're doing, what they're trying to accomplish, and what you're trying to do, and then use what is appropriate for that. Yeah, make things appropriate. Okay, match the system that you're using to the forage resources. Again, the type of vegetation is there. Is it native range? Is it old CRP? Is it sub-irrigated, irrigated pasture? Whatever it is, match your grazing system to that. Desired level of management, we have our sliding scale of intensity. Just alongside that, labor resources. How much do you want to be doing in this system? Do you have the drive and the passion to be out there moving your animals all the time? Are you also farming when you need to be doing that? Because if so, maybe you don't have the resources and you can be doing a little bit less intense system, which, like I said before, might not be bad. You might be able to be doing a really good job without doing the whole hog rotational electric fence grazing. And grazing systems are really just the start. What grazing systems are is application of principles of the 4 pillars that we talked about to a pasture or a group of pastures or a ranch to achieve a goal, right? We're talking about, say, rest rotation. We want to rest one of the pastures and rotate that around so that those plants can recover and range condition can improve if that's what we're trying to do. But you don't necessarily have to subscribe to the rest rotation grazing system. You may incorporate rest in the grazing plan, but then you may also incorporate other aspects of other grazing plans. And so really thinking about it bigger picture than just I have to choose a grazing system and use it and stick with it. Okay, extensive grazing systems. These are the ones that require less input, less frequent moves, larger pastures. These work better during the dormant season rather than the growing season because there is not the potential for plants to regrow and recover from grazing. And so it is not critical for plants to get that time during the dormant season because nothing's going to happen. It doesn't matter to the plant. Or where production potential is low. As you intensify your grazing management, you get closer to reaching the potential productivity of the plants, the soil, and of the landscape you're on. But if the production potential is already low, if you're already on dry rangeland with poor soils, then you might be the best manager, but you might not see that much of a return in what the range produces. Again, extensive rangeland, these are pretty much interchangeable, or where poor livestock distribution is acceptable. I'm thinking of things like extensive BLM or Forest Service, where it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to subdivide that up and go out and move livestock every couple of days or every day. If you're grazing 300 cows on 20,000 acres for 2 months or 3 months, then poor distribution is probably okay, given that they're not going to be completely destroying the areas that they're going to be congregating in. Intensive systems. Just the opposite of what I was saying for extensive systems. They work much more effectively in the growing season when your plants have the capability to regrow and recover from grazing. And again, where production potential is high. This is why there are so many intensive systems on irrigated pasture or sub-irrigated meadows, or even dry land, say like what we would consider hay fields. The production potential there is really high. So as you increase the intensity of your management, you can see the return from that. Irrigated pasture, again, goes with that, or poor condition rangeland. If you want to improve the health or condition of your rangeland, those plants are going to need to recover in some way. And so you're probably going to need to be doing some sort of more intensive system. Doesn't have to be using electric fence per se, but you're probably going to want to incorporate some aspect of recovery during the growing season for those plants. I wouldn't recommend grazing every year in April, May, and June if you want to make a pasture improve in condition. You can think about this, that extensive systems are like a sword with accomplishing your goals. Works pretty well for what you're doing. You can go wrong and you can hack something up. Intensive systems, on the other hand, they're like a scalpel in that you have a whole lot more control over what you're doing. You can be really exact and precise, but they can also be like a battle axe because you're managing animals at much higher density. And if you're moving them every couple days and you miss a day or they're somewhere for too long, then you're really gonna raise that harder than you would have liked. Whereas if you are moving livestock and they've been in a pasture for a month and you're late by a day or two from what you had planned, that really doesn't matter. So this is how I think of it, is that intensive management, you can do a whole lot more, but you have to be really careful. Okay, now we're going to get to electric fence. So here's a good question. Quite often when you're talking to someone and you ask them about their grazing system, they say, oh yeah, I use electric fence. Or, oh yeah, my neighbor is using electric fence. But what does it actually mean when someone is grazing with electric fence? And I would submit to you that it really doesn't mean all that much. Taken literally, right? Grazing with electric fence is not a grazing system. Electric fence is a tool that you use to accomplish your goals. It would be kind of like the same thing if someone said, no, what's your grazing system? I said, oh yeah, I use barbed wire. Like it sounds silly, right? That's not what people mean, but that is the definition of the words that they are using. Generally, what people mean when they are using electric fence is that it is some form of management intensive grazing. I guess a quick aside, I'm using electric fence. Well, I just moved cows last week, Monday. And they have been in a pasture for 3 months, and I've been using electric fence as permanent fence for the last 3 years in this pasture. Now, that is not management intensive grazing. That is quite extensive management, but I'm still using electric fence. My cows are going to be calving in a pasture right now that I'm using electric fence, but just to cut it in half. Now, that is also not management intensive grazing. I'm using it as a tool to accomplish my goals. Okay. There are so many terms that describe things that are very similar. Electric fence is typically used in very intensive management, anywhere from moving multiple times per day, every day, all the way to like what I'm doing. Holistic management, regenerative grazing, savory grazing, mob grazing. There are so many terms out there, and if you ask 10 people what they mean when they talk about grazing with electric fence, you'll probably get 15 definitions. I can come up with multiple definitions right now. And so just to understand when I'm saying this, other people define management intensive grazing differently than I do. I'm just using it as a catch-all term for management that is on the more intense side of grazing, meaning you're moving them more frequently, smaller paddocks, and so on. Because of that, comparing two people that are using electric fence without knowing exactly what they're doing doesn't mean you're comparing apples to apples, right? If you're comparing someone that, say, has a rest rotation grazing system to someone else, there's going to be differences, but I would suggest that they're more similar than potentially what two people are doing with electric fence. If that's all you know, if you don't know the system that they're doing or how they are using their electric fence. use electric fence or any grazing system, again, it's just fence. And so you can do anything with it. Okay, generally, with intensive grazing of electric fence, you can say everything that we already said about rotational grazing, about the control that we have over stocking rate and distribution and season of use. You can say those things about electric fence. Again, it's just usually more intense. You have more control. It's more like having a scalpel. Nice thing with temporary electric fence, I have to specify because there's permanent electric fence too. It is extremely flexible in space and time, meaning, like I said earlier, you can sculpt the landscape. You can say, I'm going to make a paddock that does this going up the hill, and you can do it. And the next day you can do something completely different in time, meaning it's not like a barbed wire fence where you build it and then you learn, once the cows are there, you learn how they use the new pasture, and you say, well, gosh, I really should have fenced this draw in it or fenced this out of it. Next year or the next time you're grazing an area, if you're using temporary electric fence, you can do whatever you want and it will be completely different. You can learn with the system. That's the really nice thing, is that you're investing labor into it, but it's not permanent. And so you can refine it as you go, and it gets better and better the more you learn. Okay, case study for how I am using these principles on the ranch. I work at MSU's Red Bluff Research Ranch in Norris. It's a 13,000 acre ranch. Most of the ranch is rangeland. We have 250 acres of sub-irrigated meadow and about 100 acres of irrigated fields, hay or pasture. We'll talk about that in the next couple slides. Rangeland, pretty typical for this part of the state, dominated by blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue. The hillsides are covered in Rocky Mountain juniper and limber pine. We don't really have much sagebrush except in our highest elevation pasture. So unlike the Ruby Valley in this side of things, it is almost exclusively a grassland. We run 200 cows and 500 ewes. We calve in, we say it's May, they start in April. We just started last week, and we land in April. They also just started last week, but we'll calve through the beginning of June. We'll land through the second week of April.
No, how do you sub-irrigate that meadow?
So sub-irrigation, at least in the way I am referring to it, it just means there is so much water in that area, the water table's high.
Okay.
And so just think of like a wetland meadow.
Yeah, naturally.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
The beavers help a lot. Okay, my management philosophy. I came up with this term today, strategically low input. I would say low input, but not wholesale low input. I'm low input when I determine the animals need to be, and I give them what I think they need, but not what they want. Okay, the cows, they graze 12 months out of the year, at least they have the past 2 years. Well, let me back up for a second. I took over management of Red Bluff. This would be my 3rd year there. And historically had been a same number of animals, same sheep and cows, historically been calving in March. And the year I took over, they bred the cows to start calving in May. And so they basically said, well, figure it out. And so I had the opportunity to rethink how the ranch was managed and how to graze the animals across the ranch, how I wanted to do things. We have a lot of feed out there. There's enough wind in Norris that it keeps the range mostly clear. And if not, I can stockpile feed so the cows can dig through snow. They know how to do that just fine. They've done it all this winter. So the cows graze year round. This is what I was talking about, supplementation. I'm pretty careful with, I keep track of the animals' diets, keep track of their body condition, and I give them the amount of protein I think they need. Right now, I've got first calf heifers. They're gonna start calving maybe the end of this week, first part of next week. They're about body conditions 4 or 5. Haven't had a lick of hay since they were calves. I'm pretty pleased with how they're doing. We got some cows just coming off the study. They're looking pretty good too. Sheep, they graze about 10 months out of the year. It's hard to make sheep graze after you shear them in March, especially when it's cold and snowy. And so I would change that if I could, but we're kind of limited logistically with what we can do. I use grazing to manage the diet. This is a topic for a whole other conversation, but basically, if I wanted to have a higher quality diet, I can change that just with grazing. And so I use grazing and supplementation to manage my animals throughout the year. Okay, I don't subscribe to a specific grazing system. Like I was saying before, I take the principles from different grazing systems that I like, and I use them to come up with what I do in my grazing plan. Okay, my rangeland, like I said, this is my primary forage base. Spring is a critical period for range in this part of the country. This is when it grows. We've only got about 45 days of good growing weather in May and June. So on my rangeland, I change the location that I'm grazing every year so that there is that element of recovery that we were talking about. So that a plant is not grazed at the same time every year. I also graze stockpiled forage from the previous year until June, just to ensure that if there is not much growth in May, my animals are not relying on the growth that happens in May. They're relying on growth that happened the previous May. This also generally takes care of any issues I have with grass tetany because they're grazing on old feed mixed with new feed that's coming up. Rangeland also makes pretty good fall and winter feed, especially if we get any fall moisture and Idaho fescue greens up. It is incredible. With my GPS call work, I've sat and watched cows graze in the winter, and they can find all the green. Okay. The irrigated fields, historically, these were all hay fields, like most places around here. I have transitioned them from being strictly hay fields to being hay and grazing fields, kind of a flexibility. I don't need the hay as much in the wintertime anymore because the cows are grazing. And it's expensive to feed it and to put it up. And my cows benefit from the green grass in the summertime. They don't need the green grass in the form of hay in the winter. So I'm going to take the cows to the green grass in the summer when it's growing. Here, I use intensive grazing, generally about 1 to 3 day moves. Because, here I've got because on here. Why did I do this? Because the fields have very high production potential. I want to take advantage of that high production and realize the potential that is there. It's during the growing season, and so there is potential for recovery. If I'm only on a spot for 1 to 3 days, the grass doesn't know what hit it. It might think a swather hit it, might think a cow hit it. It doesn't know, but it's going to start recovering just as soon as it gets moisture again. And there is uniform use. If they just start knocking down the feed and you're in a hay field, you're going to be shading things and you might have some problems. I had problems with this last year. These are my goals. The actual application is a little more rough, but we're working on it there. Okay, sub-irrigated meadow. We have more sub-irrigated meadow than we do hayland, but it's substantially less productive and more difficult to manage. The meadows at Red Bluff, they got a lot of willows, got a lot of side channels, swamping areas, dry and others. Historically, there wasn't a whole lot of use there, and any use they did have, they had problems with stream bank damage and people trying to potentially litigate if they didn't change their management. Anyway, I use intensive grazing on these fields, anywhere from 2 to 10 day moves, just because it is more complex to manage. And for almost the exact same reasons as the irrigated fields. High production potential relative to rangeland. It's during the growing season. I want the forage in the meadow to be able to recover. And if I'm only there for a couple days, I'm not going to see the problems of stream bank damage that would happen if the animals were in there for a long time. I do also use some dormant season use when everything is frozen, so that they can go and clean up the meadows a little bit. I haven't fully tapped into that yet. I have some years, but not all years, but there's just so much feed there. The potential is there.
When you're doing those, quicker rotations in the meadows.
Yes.
Are they still hitting the willows pretty hard, or do they pretty much stay on the grass?
Pretty much stay in the grass. I try to fence them out of the thickest part of the willows. But yeah, I would assume they would do some damage if I put them in where there was a lot of willows. Beavers.
Do they have any preference over the versus the grass?
Mm. I think they do in the winter time.
Yeah.
In the growing season, I'm not sure. I've never let them go too hard on them.
Are you grazing, are you watering them from the creek or are you watering?
Yes. Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of beaver activity on Hot Springs Creek right there. And so there's spots where it's deep enough, they don't even try to go, and they will pretty much choose just a couple areas. And they do trample it down a little bit, but not horrendously.
Yeah. Can be done correctly.
Yes, and
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure this out because it is such a difficult
Yeah.
meadow
Some-
complex.
Some disturbance on the bank lines is it's honestly necessary and good, and it'll recruit vegetation as well, so,
Mhm.
sorry,
No, good,
questioning that.
good comment. Okay, here we go. Now, just a little bit of a quick example of what I have done. So here's the metropolis of Norris. This is Sterling Road. 287, Highway 84, where it tees in. These are my two hay fields. This field's about 35 acres. This one's 35 acres, this one's 15, and this one is close to 50, like 45 acres. Anyway, I've got wheel lines over all of them. Right now, this one is an alfalfa mix, and these two are sown into grass. These are new seedings. And so they are just now kind of coming in maturity this year. This is just an example of what I did last year. So when I first bring cows in, I want to make sure that they are well acquainted with an electric fence and well acquainted with respecting it. So turn them into a larger pasture or paddock. This one is about 20 acres. This is that meadow type, was an entirely productive meadow, and they were there for about a week. And then ramped up intensity, moved them to a smaller paddock, but not so small that there's the chance of them blowing up and getting out. Again, they're still learning it. The calves are still learning it. The calves kind of seem to go out of electric fence anyway. It's kind of like 3 feet in my way. And water tanks tied into the irrigation main line. And so the cows were drinking out of a tank. They weren't drinking out of any live water when they were here. They were there for a couple days. And then I slowly increased the intensity of the movement, moved to this next paddock that I built. They were there for, I think, 2 days. And then I started going into what some call a fishbone style of electric fences, where basically you build these long runs, and then all you have to do to move your animals every day, this is daily movement by that point, is build a cross fence. And they graze up these lanes, and then when they're ready for the next one, bring them down into the next lane. They're here, and then they're here, and they're here, and they're here. And all the time that they're in this new run, they're able to back graze over what they did the previous set of days. It does not seem to be a problem because it's still only a handful of days, so there's not significant regrowth happening. And they really don't spend much time here other than lounging down by the water tank. And so you don't have the incredible hoof action like you would if you just turned them out into the entire thing. Added benefit is they waste a whole lot less than if you just turn them out there. Any questions with this? This is extremely basic. Yeah. Okay. In conclusion, know why you are doing what you're doing with your grazing plan. think about what your goals are. Think about what your goals are, what your vision is for what you want to accomplish, and then work backwards toward the grazing system. Don't take a grazing system and try to make it work for what your goals are. Know what do you want to do to the plants? What do you want to do to the animals? And how are you going to get there? Because it might not necessarily be electric fence intensive grazing every day. I don't use electric fence on dry rangeland at Red Bluff because for me, it doesn't make sense given my time and labor resources and given what I think it would do for the rangeland that's there. In general, the rangeland at Red Bluff's in pretty good condition. I do still implement rest on some of the rangeland that I'm going to graze in the spring. And I do a lot of deferred use on it just due to the nature. I've got 36 pastures I rotate through. And so most of them are going to get deferred to the dormant season because I'm grazing 12 months out of the year. The dormant season is a whole lot of the year. And so there's a lot of pastures that I can allow complete growing season rest so they can recover from any previous grazing. So when you're thinking about grazing system, think through these things about what you're doing, why you're doing them. And that will help you create a grazing plan that works for what you want to do. Intensive grazing systems have a ton of potential, but they are a lot of labor. You got to have a lot of passion to do them, and just a lot of work to go out there, move electric fence, pick it up, your cows get out, you got to go get them back in, especially like it's in a hayfield, irrigated field, you really don't want them out. And like I said, it can be a battle axe. If you mismanage it, you might do some damage. The nice thing is, because it's generally so short, you have a lot of time for recovery. Here's kind of the way I think about it. If you're using intensive grazing in the growing season, your focus is on plant recovery, is on giving those plants as much of the growing season as they can to recover from any grazing that has happened. In the dormant season, this mostly focuses on utilization efficiency, right? You ramp up grazing management, you're going to be wasting less feed once you get to a certain point. Or in my case, I stockpile feed so I can move into fresh pasture all winter long. Like I said, I just moved heifers this week into a new pasture. It's still the dormant season in my book. Till there's enough green grass, even though it's starting to come in. There are people, if anyone has been to Stephen Livestock in Cascade, they graze under electric fence year round. In the wintertime, they're moving every day. I think they just changed to moving twice a day. And the focus there is utilization efficiency. It's mostly rough esky rangeland. They do really well. Then they also don't supplement protein. I don't know how they do that, but I want to learn. In the growing season, they're up to about week 10-day rotations. I've got another friend not too far from there that does the opposite. In the growing season, he's moving every day. In the dormant season, he's moving about once a week. It all depends on forage resources, labor resources, and logistics of your operation. Make a plan, think about what you're doing, but in the end, just go for it. And you might make a few mistakes, but you're going to learn. And that is the beauty of doing this. That's all I got.
No.
Yes.
How many of your paddocks and pastures are completely rested every year that you don't even touch? Do you have a few?
None that are of considerable size. There's a handful of 5-10 acre pastures around the old headquarters that are just not worth it to graze because the fences are in poor condition. I'm actually not a fan of resting pastures, except in specific instances, like if it's in poor condition and if you want to help it recover and improve. And here's why, unless you're doing that, I think it's justified. If you've got 12 months in a year, if you remove one pasture from that, your stocking rate goes up on your remaining pastures unless you destock accordingly. Does that make sense?
Or you have a big year?
Or you have a good year, but you're not always gonna have a good year.
Another question, with the fire that you guys had,
Yes.
how is that affecting the club mops? We were curious and that was gonna be something to be watched as it came back.
I don't know. Clayton Marlowe is doing vegetation work on the study that's going on there. And I don't have an answer for you right now. But I would say that the grasses have recovered phenomenally. It took a very trained eye this past year to tell the difference between burned and unburned. There was, yeah, not quite complete recovery. It's a little bit of an earlier cereal stage, but I zero issues with grazing it at a normal stocking rate. This
Might
past
have
year.
been the best thing for it then.
I think so. Yeah.
Because it was just a mat, and after the fire went through, you could walk out there and just peel it off the soil.
Mhm.
It's mats. So I assumed it was dead, but it had sealed the soil.
I think some of it did burn and die, but then some of it, even if it did die, it didn't burn and it's still there, preventing anything from coming through it. Because there are parts of what burned that look really good and parts kind of down by the dumpsters.
Yeah.
That part of the burn is just not very productive.
Another question, I'm the only one asking, I guess. What did you plant on that, irrigated field that you intensive grazed, that you with the paddocks?
That, couple different seed mixtures based on availability, but basically Fairfield seed mix of smooth brome, meadow brome, orchard grass, and timothy.
Would you do anything different, add to it?
I am happy with it now. I don't know enough about forages. Orchard grass I like because it's really good feed. And the brome seems to grow well. It's very productive in terms of biomass. So yeah, I'm happy with it now, but
It is.
I'm ignorant.
You know, watching that out there, the amount of, the nutrients going back into that soil, and those cattle grazing it is phenomenal compared to what used to have to be put on as fertilizer.
Mhm. Yeah, that's the other nice thing with moving so frequently is your manure spreaders are doing their job. You don't have to spread it for
Your neighbors just have to get their cows to respect an electric fence.
them. Yeah.
The neighbors, the cows would get out, walk down the road and jump in with this because they didn't know what an electric fence was. Then they'd go hide in there.
Whole new world.
They thought they died and went to heaven and followed that green forest.
So it better. You use collars. Are those, have you worked towards like managing the movement of your cows with the collars yet?
No, so you're talking about virtual fence. correct?
Yes.
So the collars we use are just GPS receivers for research purposes, figuring out why the cows are going where they are, where they're grazing.
Mhm.
We just had a meeting last month about implementing a virtual fence system so that we could do this from the computer without electricity. And that would be incredible. But the technology has improved incredibly over the past couple of years, but it is not quite at a point where I think it would be wise to invest in.
Mhm.
But we've talked about that, and there definitely is a strong potential for that in the future.
How do you map your like paddocks as you're moving during like intensive grazing?
Right now, I have a free app on my phone that I plan out the paddocks and their size. And the eventual goal, I've got a database on my computer built. I haven't transferred any of that information to it, but I do use the different GIS software programs, but nothing like ready to use ones like Pasture Map or there's a handful of others.
So are your your paddocks the same every year, or are you changing it up as well?
Changing it up.
Okay. Figuring it out as we go.
Exactly.
Would you go back to that map of the little paddocks on that irrigated ground?
Mhm.
Was there a reason you didn't go farther to the west?
Oh.
And then on down to the south on that dry land piece?
Yes, this actually isn't a map of the paddocks I used. It's an approximation of about half of them.
Oh, okay, I got you. So you did. I was thinking that you had
Yeah.
it all the way up against that west fence. Okay.
Yes,
What about, did you do the dry land piece to the south?
down here,
Yeah.
no, because I came into these way too late last year, which I'm doing different this year. And so by the time I was done here, I had 10,000 pounds of dry matter that my cows were trying to work through. 5 ton of, I mean, the grass was literally 6 feet tall. So this down here is alfalfa, crested wheatgrass. I think it used to be flood irrigated. There's a ditch in there. I would have liked to use that if I needed it, but last year I didn't need it. This year I am planning on using it.
Where will you water them?
When they're there,
Yeah.
I'm thinking I'm gonna make a alleyway that goes down to the Burn Creek.
What was the utilization factor that you were trying for on that there, where you had 5 ton of dry matter per acre? Were you going for about a 50% or a little more than that to try and?
No, with irrigated stuff, you can hammer it way harder than range. And in this case, so there's a couple different strategies. If it's vegetative, I would say hit it 50 to 70%, kind of depending on how much is there, because you want to leave enough so it can regrow rapidly. This got away from me very badly. And so my goal went from grazing it to let it regrow, to knock it down so I don't have standing dead the next year. So my cows were actually only grazing about 50% of it. But they were knocking down the rest of it. I guess I didn't talk about this, the utilization factor thing goes out the window a little bit when you're doing really intensive grazing. And it's more of a eyeball, how much is left kind of a factor. Kind of a cop-out answer.
I thought you were gonna say that you had your measuring stuff on out there, figuring out how much you had left behind and calculated it on out.
There was not much left behind.
You didn't pick up those cow pies to see what
What was underneath?
was still in there,
No,
nutrient cycling.
yeah.
Is it affecting your worm load and your flies? Having them more intensive on that pasture?
Not that I noticed.
I didn't either, but I'm curious that it. Driving by them, I never saw them battling flies,
Mhm.
but I don't know what your regimen is for that either.
Drenching them in the spring.
Because they seem content and happy.
Yeah, I mean, other than by the time it was over, it was like eating straw, but they're happy.
They had shade, even when they were doing that straw, it was so tall.
Yeah.
Are your sheep down in the irrigated, sub-irrigated during the growing season as well?
No, because of the sheep. Because they're sheep, we have a herder that lives with the sheep. generally go up high during the growing season. They do come down here though, and I didn't mention this, in the fall. So kind of my goal is to graze through this in the summer, once or twice, and then let it regrow, but don't let it go to seed by the time fall hits, so that it is still nutritious. And then the sheep come in here just prior to breeding in October and November, so that it flushes them. And so they are down there, but in the fall.
Noah, what's your breed back rate since you started grazing your cows 12 months of the year?
It's been about 90%. It's lower than I'd like, but not a disaster.
And are you losing any body score from when they start in the fall till calving time?
No, generally what has happened the past couple of years is right at weaning time, their body condition score is, well, we've had pretty nasty storms right around the time we've weaned the past couple of years. And so they've been just below a 5. And then I slowly increased their protein supplement regimen through the winter, and they gain condition. So it stays pretty constant. I would say it's slightly upward just from where they start in the fall. And they come into calving right at about 5. But then Sebin livestock up in Cascade, they don't do any protein supplementation. They calve end of May, June, and they say their cows come into calving at a body condition score of 6. So I don't know how they're doing what they're doing. I think that has a lot to do with genetics and the rough fescue that they're on. Any other questions?
What breed are you running right now?
We have about half of our herd is commercial Angus based, Hereford influence. And then the other half is purebred Angus.
Do you think they utilize this program well, or would there be a different variety that would do better?
The commercials seem to work really well, just because they have hybrid vigor, they do a lot of things better. We just started this Angus program a few years ago, and so our genetics are kind of a broad mix of things. There are certain cows that are doing well in the system and certain cows with certain genetics that are not. So our goal is that in the future, we have genetics that works really well for what we're doing. But because the commercial herd has been there for so long, they do pretty well. I mean, they graze in the wintertime. Even before I started here, they didn't graze 12 months. So the cows, they knew they had to work.